All right, I think we're going to get underway here. It's 12:15. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are delighted to be joined by the Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. His name is Kerlikowske. Please welcome Director Kerlikowske to Marquette Law School.
Thanks.
Good to have you here. I want to say a special thanks to the director and his staff because you flew out here a little early in anticipation of a nice day of weather in Washington, D.C. today. You going to be here with us tonight, too?
Or maybe for a couple days. Your lunch is looking pretty good. So.
Washington does so well with snow, don't they?
Yeah, they handle it well.
Exactly. I thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about your background. You're a former cop. You're the former police commissioner in Buffalo, former Seattle police chief. Mm-hmm. How did that prepare you for the job you're doing today?
I think the thing that helps you to really recognize that it's not a war on drugs is the fact that you see so many people that are cycled through a system that doesn't serve them very well. So when you recognize that addiction is a disease, and you recognize that treatment works, and you recognize that the criminal justice system can be a supportive and important player, but that the public health officials and others need to also be more involved, then you know that you can probably make a better protection for the community that you took an oath of office to serve and to protect.
I want to spend some time exploring the way you view drug control policy at this moment in our history. But I do want to set the table a little bit, and I want to talk about the scope of our national drug problem as you see it today. Let's begin there. What are we looking at? And help us understand in terms of incarceration, in terms of drug-related suicides, all of that.
Sure. What people often say is, you know, what's the nation's drug problem? And the nation doesn't have a drug problem. We have a series of regional drug problems. To give you an example, methamphetamine is a significant problem in the Midwest and the West. Methamphetamine is virtually unknown in the Northeast. Prescription drug problems have a greater impact in certain areas of the country, perhaps disproportionately so in Appalachia than they do in a number of other places. So we have to look at it for the complex problem that it is. We also are pleased to begin to see the downturn in the prison population in the United States. For the last 2 years, the prison population has decreased. The New York Times piece just this week really attributed a lot of that to changes in not only drug arrests, but to drug sentencing, because we think there are smarter ways. In fact, we know there are smarter ways to deal with this problem.
You like the idea of drug courts. You like that idea?
Drug courts are about now 2,600. And when I worked for Attorney General Janet Reno, the first drug court was coming into play, and it was in Miami, where she had been the state attorney, where she'd been the chief prosecutor. Now the research is clear. The Urban Institute has completed a 5-year evaluation of drug courts and found them not only to be effective, but also to be more cost effective. So we think that drug courts can really help to bring people back. And if you've never visited a drug court graduation and you go and you're not moved, you kind of have a heart of stone.
How many have you gone to?
I've gone now to several hundred drug court graduations. I served on the drug court executive board when I was the chief in Seattle, and certainly on the drug court. And now, of course, we're seeing veterans courts. There are about 90 veterans courts because we're seeing a lot of our military that are coming back and having some problems, particularly at times around prescription drugs. And we need that kind of specialized court, boutique court, as some people would call them, to help them get back on the right track.
I did want to ask you, you mentioned prescription drugs. I think it was the National Centers for Disease Control that said that this is an epidemic in America. You agree with that assessment?
The CDC under Dr. Frieden has determined that prescription drug problem is an epidemic driven by opioid painkillers. So last year, in 2011, 16,600 people died. That is greater than heroin and cocaine deaths combined in this country. And you know, these are drugs not coming across a border. They're not being smuggled in. They're coming right out of our own medicine cabinet.
Let's talk about the cocaine and heroin problem in this country. I'm old enough to remember, and as are a few of us in the room today, a time in the late 80s and early 90s in Milwaukee when the crack epidemic hit, and we saw the homicide rate just blow right through the roof. Where do we stand today? Is crack a sort of a historic relic? Is it still a problem? What about cocaine use?
Well, crack cocaine is still somewhat of a problem, but if you look at the levels associated around the violence of the crack cocaine problem, you know, people often attribute the reduction, particularly in the minority community, with the fact that education and information has been exchanged about the true dangers. Right now, according to one of the reports in Brazil actually has a higher number, even though it's a considerably smaller country, a higher number of crack cocaine users in Brazil than in the United States. So essentially, this is a cheap and pretty devastating drug, and they're very concerned about it. But we've made some real progress. I mean, our cocaine use in this country is something that we should be pleased with, because cocaine consumption is down by about 40% from that 2006-2007 period.
And again, this is because of law enforcement efforts, because of how do you because of your efforts? Yeah.
Yeah. No. What I mean. So I think it becomes, and you know, everyone wants to be the parent of this success. Sure. But I think if you listen to people, the cocaine production in Colombia is down dramatically. The ability to interdict cocaine coming into the United States has increased significantly because of border and interdiction efforts. That's kind of one issue. But the other issue is the recognition that the drug is harmful, that it causes problems, that quality prevention programs and education that isn't a scare tactic can actually make a difference in people deciding what to use or perhaps what not to use.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about the marijuana issue in just a couple of moments, but I want to segue in.
I was hoping to avoid that.
No. But I want to segue into a somewhat larger discussion, and that is this whole issue of how we perceive what national drug control policy should be. You have said that it shouldn't be one or the other. It shouldn't be the war on drugs versus the legalization of drugs. You think there's a third way for national drug control policy. Can you describe what that is? You touched on it. You say treatment is obviously part of it, but go into some depth on that.
We very much do see this third way. The war on drugs made a great bumper sticker, but it was a totally inadequate answer to what is really a very complex problem. Legalization is just as easy a bumper sticker with no more particular answer to our drug problem than war on drugs. But right here in the middle, we have a lot of things that work. For instance, in the last decade, we've learned more about drug prevention programs than we've known in a long time. And we know that drug prevention programs can work, and they can be very cost effective. We know that treatment can work, particularly when drug treatment is combined with the public health and primary care, that it isn't some segregated drug treatment program out all by itself. So when it's part of primary care, that can be effective. We know that reduced incarceration, and we know that for the number of people that are arrested in this country for all kinds of crimes, not just drug crimes, about 50% have a drug problem or a drug nexus. So if we invest in programs that help to treat that, treatment behind the walls kind of we call it, and then aftercare services, because they are all going to get out, or almost everyone will get out of custody. We can actually reduce recidivism, and we've seen that in study after study also. So it's just very hard until you have a forum like this. It's very hard to talk about this third way, because the two bumper stickers at either end are just so much easier.
Well, let me explore one of those bumper stickers, the war on drugs. I mean, there will be people sitting out there probably in the audience who say, well, what is he saying? Is he saying that we're going to be take a softer stance toward people who are committing offenses that are related to drug sale or possession? What specifically are you talking about? Why does that term bother you so much?
Well, I think it bothers me because none of my colleagues, including Chief Flynn for many years, none of my colleagues ever talked about a war on drugs. They didn't express it as a war on drugs. In fact, if I listened to my former colleagues as chiefs and sheriffs, the phrase that they would use is that you can't arrest your way out of this drug problem in this country. And I think that's what makes it kind of not only fun but special to be able to come back to Milwaukee. This is my second visit. The police department in Milwaukee has taken some extraordinary steps to partner with not-for-profits and non-governmental organizations to support them in prevention programs, in treatment programs, et cetera, and recognizing that it's pretty hard to call a police chief or a former police chief, either one of us, soft on drugs or soft on crime when we're advocating these kinds of changes.
You know, there are people out there. This is, I think, an attitudinal issue, too, because there are probably more than a few people out there who think when you talk about drug addiction that in some respects you're talking about not a disease, but almost a moral failing of sorts.
Right.
How do you change the attitudes, change the discussion about the nature of what we're talking about?
Well, we've approached, and the president has been very clear about making decisions based on science and based on the information, not based on ideology. So if you look at, and frankly, I think I was in this camp 10 plus years ago, you know, drug addiction is something that people should just go find God. They should pull themselves up from their bootstraps. They should just fix this problem. And I can't understand why they didn't. Then you look at the science and you look at the research done by the National Institute of Drug Abuse and others, and you clearly see that addiction is a disease. It is diagnosable, it is treatable, and actually it can be prevented in many ways. You know, if a young person stays away from drugs and alcohol till the time they're 21, the chances of them having any drug or alcohol problem in their entire lives is almost minimal. Young people, though, always get concerned because then their parents say, well, I'll just lock you up till you're 21 and then I'll let you back out into the community. But there's a lot that we can do that once we understand it, and we bring all these other resources into play that, frankly, a lot of people just look at the police department or the criminal justice system and say, solve the drug problem. And frankly, we're not capable of solving the drug problem. But together with public health, with public education, with community groups, we can make a huge difference. And with cocaine, we have.
And you're seeing some of the difference reflected, as you talked about earlier, in prison numbers. We're seeing a drop-off in the prison population for the first time in a while.
For the first time in the state prisons in the last 2 years, we've actually begun to see that decrease. The president signed the Fair Sentencing Act, which was essentially crack cocaine received a sentence of 100 times greater than powder cocaine, not for any scientific reason, but because during the crack wars or the crack epidemic, it was really looked at that way. But through bipartisan, something you don't hear a lot about right now, bipartisan. But through bipartisan legislation, that was actually changed, and I got to be in the Oval Office when the president reduced the sentencing. That is the first mandatory sentence to be reduced to go the other way in almost 4 decades. So it's a pretty significant change, and it signals a lot of the changes that are happening at the state level on criminal justice reform and, frankly, drug policy reform.
You want to get more people into treatment. Does anything in the Affordable Care Act allow you to do that?
It could mean that 23 million more people are eligible for drug treatment.
23 million?
Yes, that would not be eligible for treatment before. And the Affordable Care Act, under essential benefits, includes parity issues for mental health and substance abuse. And we also know that when there is a mental health issue and a substance abuse issue, that we can have significant problems, or a person can, particularly with violence. So we really need to make sure that the public health people, and then of course a labor force that's available and trained in that area, and here we're talking jobs, can be involved in working to help people get the kind of treatment. If you get the treatment early and the intervention occurs early, it's almost always not only more effective, it's also less costly.
Are we making progress? Because I think some of the conventional wisdom out there says that our drug problem maybe a little different problem today than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but we still have a serious drug problem. Not that much has changed in America. Do you think much has changed?
Well, over the 30 years, the reduction of drug use, the consumption of drugs overall in the country is down by about a third. And I mentioned the reductions in methamphetamine use around 2006 and 2007, the reductions in cocaine use. But I think that one of the biggest concerns is the fact that the prescription drugs, which are in the medicine cabinets, that has not been recognized and it has not been understood. And frankly, 4 years ago, I don't think you could count half a dozen newspaper articles about prescription drugs. When I was getting briefed for my confirmation hearing with the Senate, it was brought up to me that, well, you do know that drug overdoses, prescription drugs, are killing more people in this country than gunshot wounds. And frankly, I was surprised. And I asked my colleagues, et cetera. They were surprised. Now, unfortunately and sadly, it not only is taking more deaths than gunshot wounds, drugs are taking more deaths than car crashes. And that should be a huge wake-up call.
Mm-hmm. I want to spend a couple minutes on the marijuana issue, which has been in the news lately. I guess let's begin with the referenda that were held in Washington State and in Colorado, where citizens said they would like marijuana legalized for recreational use. Did your office take a position on that issue?
Our office hasn't changed at all on the policy issues. The president, of course, has spoken out routinely on opposing legalization. But our office looks at this issue from the public health and the science. Inhaling the smoke into your lungs is not a particularly good thing when it comes to people's health. Individual states, and of course I was in Washington for 9 years, that have that proposition or the ability to put something like that in front of the voters, was an awful lot of money that was spent on some very slick commercials, and unfortunately there was no PolitiFact to take a look at those. For instance, the Rand Corporation took a look at whether or not in California, when this came up and the voters voted it down several years ago, whether or not the taxes could be collected. They threw a real pitcher of cold water on the ability to collect taxes on something that can be grown in your backyard. There's also the belief that it would reduce violence in Mexico, and we've been talking about these international issues. The Rand Corporation threw cold water again on that legalizing marijuana would reduce the violence in Mexico. So we don't see any of the science and the facts supporting this. The legal questions are questions that are best left with the Attorney General and the Department of Justice.
Is it challenging? Because on the one hand, you're talking about, I guess, potentially a big industry, but on the other hand, you're talking about something that's a federal crime. How do you, and that's an interesting conundrum, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is, and I think the big industry issue is the one big question that's out there, and that, of course, is the potential for the rebirth of big tobacco. We've seen significant reductions in young people's use. We see more marijuana use with young people than we see with tobacco. So we've had great changes in reducing the tobacco problem. But does anyone kind of really believe that if this becomes a large moneymaker, that big tobacco organizations or big organizations are not going to want to be involved in this. The history of some of the research during the tobacco litigation shows that this was certainly something that was thought of by that industry many years ago.
Do you have any idea on how soon before we hear from Attorney General Holder or the Obama administration on what its stance is going to be in light of these votes in Colorado and Washington?
Well, the Attorney General was reported in his speech to the National Association of Attorneys General when they met in Washington about 2 weeks ago.
Said soon,
that he
didn't
was, I think, relatively soon to the decision. And in our office, we don't interfere or become involved in what is distinctly a legal issue with the Department of Justice.
I wanted to get your take on marijuana for medical use, because in some places in the country, actually a number of states now, California is a good example, Colorado another good example, where I think there are more than 500 dispensaries for medical marijuana. How do you feel about that? Has that ended up being something other than what people thought it would be, or what's your...
Well, I think it has ended up being something other than what people thought it would be, because it was voted on and passed in California in 1996. And the year before I became police chief in Seattle in 2000, it was voted on. Marijuana has never been through the FDA process. We have a world-renowned process to decide what is a drug and what isn't a drug and what can be on the market.
You think it should go through
marijuana?
The process?
Well, I think it should go through the process. I don't think there's a lot of initiative by the large pharmaceutical companies because it's very expensive to bring a new product to market. I don't think there's a lot of initiative. But the other thing that comes up is that, well, no research can be done. Because it's a Schedule I drug, meaning it's at the highest level of something that does not have medical value. And yet there are about over 200 researchers that have a license to study the properties of marijuana. We have some things already on the market. There are things called Marinol and Sesamet that are both properties of marijuana that can be prescribed by a physician. And there is a third one in final clinical trials called Sativex, which is involved in use with MS and the muscle spasticity that occurs with that disease. And that is in use in Canada and Europe and is in final clinical trials. The difference here is that none of these have the properties to get people high. And if you look at the research in California, the sickest group of people there needing medical marijuana are 30-year-old white males. And I never actually saw them as being a particularly unhealthy group.
Bottom line, you believe that marijuana is not benign. That's an accurate statement?
Well, we know that the THC properties, the potency of marijuana has changed significantly from dating yourself and myself, from our era, which was relatively minor in the single digits, to 22 to 30% potency, and I guess we just don't know enough about it. We know that calls to hotlines, a person that calls an 800 number and said, look, I need help with a drug problem, marijuana eclipses the other drugs in several states, and we know that it's not a benign substance.
I guess maybe my final question on this would be, what about the people who will make the argument, maybe they have a health ailment and they're using marijuana, and they say it helps me deal with the pain. And in their view, marijuana is safer than alcohol or safer than cigarettes. They see it as something that helps them. What's your response to that?
So I guess, I mean, the difficult part I have is actually just being able to kind of take off the hat and in the position that I have now. But if you look at when this was first talked about, it was often talked about people that were dealing with chemotherapy and had nausea and could be helped. And people, I think glaucoma was another one, et cetera. So let me just take off the hat I have right now and say that, look, as a police chief in a big city, I really could have cared less about those folks and what they did within their own home, as long as in particular they didn't get behind the wheel of a vehicle. I mean, they were dealing with some pretty significant issues, the people that I had seen or had known about. We had plenty of things to keep us busy, and being involved with that wasn't something that we were going to spend any time on.
Does it make sense to resolve this on a national level rather than having states sort of doing a piecemeal approach to this?
It's going to be very difficult when you have this set of, I mean, it's still a violation, marijuana, of federal law. You can't get a commercial driver's license if you test positive. We have military bases in both Washington and Colorado. We have the Air Force Academy in Colorado. You know, all of marijuana will still be a violation and continues to be a violation of federal law. So it is, I think we're in for a continuing confusing time.
Speaking of continuing confusing times, let's talk about the sequester for a moment. How does that affect your agency?
Well, the important part is that we actually have this opportunity to look at everybody's budget in the federal government, from Health and Human Services to the Department of Justice to many others, and about how they approach and deal with the drug problem and how they abide by the President's National Drug Control Strategy. Over $30 billion over the President's 4 years has been invested in prevention and treatment programs. We fund the Drug-Free Communities program, and there's some peer-reviewed research that shows that these community-based organizations can be effective in giving out a prevention message. We know that treatment programs can be effective. The sequester actually has an impact on our ability to fund those programs, the number of treatment beds that would be available. There's a lot of federal money spent in drug treatment programs that is filtered to the states. We have some numbers for Wisconsin, and it affects the ability to provide treatment into the thousands should this continue on. And we know that treatment works. We know that it's far less costly than incarcerating somebody. We'd very much like to see this not have that kind of impact.
And you will kind of wait to see what Congress does to resolve this, or you hold out hope that Congress will resolve this?
Well, you know, what's been interesting to me in the 4 years I've had the job is that the President's drug strategy has received such wide support on both sides of the aisle. Whether I was in Appalachia with the chairman of Appropriations, Congressman Rogers, whether I've been, regardless of the political stripe, people see a balanced, comprehensive policy to deal with a really significant problem that costs the United States taxpayer $193 billion a year. I've received nothing but very positive support. And the nice thing about this job in particular is that I cannot be involved in any federal election under the law that authorizes the job, which I think is was one step that Congress made and the President had approved during reauthorization that said, look, drug policy shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be one based upon science and one based upon health and education and the need for the criminal justice system to be an important and continue to be an important player.
What I'm going to do now is, we'll get to your questions in just a moment. Chief Flynn, if you want to come up and join us for a moment. Chief Ed Flynn from the Milwaukee Police Department is here with us today, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to explore this issue just a little bit further. Thanks, Christine. Appreciate it. What I wanted to hear from the Chief is some reaction to this idea that we're not really talking about a war on drugs anymore. Chief, what do you think about the term war on drugs? What do you think about some of what's been outlined by Director Kerlikowske here today?
Well, I think one thing we know is that metaphors matter. And you have to choose your metaphors very carefully, because metaphors will guide your strategies and your tactics and the self-image of the people implementing those strategies and tactics. We in the police have learned over the last 20 years that we're not at war with anybody. We in Milwaukee have adopted as our mission statement that in partnership with the community, we're going to work to develop neighborhoods capable of sustaining civic life. Dealing with crime, fear, and disorder are a means to that end where people can, live their lives in their neighborhoods safely, pursue the American dream, and raise their children. That's the goal. Crime control can help us achieve that goal. So the war on crime metaphor made it, aggressive and something you did to the community, not with the community. The war on drugs did the same thing. The war on terrorism in many ways missed the point of what we were trying to do, which is deal with a very specific threat to the nation. So, as we revisit our metaphors, I, commend the director for choosing to jettison that one because based on his experience as a police officer, he knew full well that we couldn't make neighborhoods safe unless we worked closely with them and were perceived as being helpful.
You're both, you're a current police chief, you're a former police chief. Based on your experience, do you see what Director Kerlikowske is talking about, the need for treatment in terms of dealing with the drug issue rather than it solely being a criminal justice issue?
Well, in one of my prior lives, I was the Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts, and one of the institutions that reported to me was the Department of Correction, and it came as a surprise to me to realize that I was running the biggest mental health facility in the state and the biggest drug treatment facility in the state and the biggest alcohol treatment facility in the state. What's happened over the course of many years is America politically has disinvested in the social safety network and assigned, social issues and public health issues to the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system is left holding the bag as though it was its idea to have mentally ill people and substance abusers in prison or jail. Right? We didn't have a voice in that decision. We're put in the position of using these imperfect implements to deal with these long-term public health issues. And I'll tell you one thing, every time a state wants to cut its budget and it looks at DOC, it can't cut heat. So what does it cut? Programs. All right? It cuts reentry programs, it cuts treatment programs. So we're really in a very vicious cycle. The practitioners know what's needed and try to advocate for it. But unfortunately, as I say, we've managed to criminalize a lot of public health issues.
Did you want to add to that, Director?
Well, I know from my own experience in almost 4 decades in policing that the things that have gone on here in Milwaukee and these partnerships probably don't attract as much attention or focus as some things that become, as we were talking earlier, much more high profile. But what gets done to protect the people in Milwaukee and what gets done to remove the stigma around drug use is often done in collaboration and partnership. And I've frankly been to some cities and some police departments where they've taken a stance that perhaps has not helped to facilitate the kinds of things that I just know about here in Milwaukee and know from the chief's leadership.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to open it up to questions. What I'd like you each to do, those of you in the seating bowl, press down on the button. Keep your questions brief. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Please raise your hand. We'll begin. I have a feeling this will be a tough question. We'll begin right off the bat.
I think, yeah.
You alluded to the metaphor, war on drugs. Perhaps a war on students would be more appropriate. I just had the opportunity to have done my taxes, and on 1040, there's a question of the child or the tax education credit, whether your child has ever been arrested for drugs. And if you have ever filled out a FAST application or your drug or receipt student aid, and you get arrested for drugs, you are ineligible until you comply with certain conditions that the government imposes. One is 2 random urine tests, and the other is an alcohol or other drug assessment in a successful rehabilitation program. And my fear is that we're just adding another layer of bureaucracy by semi-adopting the medical model versus the incarceration model. And all I see is an expansion of both conditions. And when you commented on the war on drugs has been a failure in some respects, but you said that the DARE or prevention education programs, prevention is
programs.
Successful. And I would argue that there's been a pretty poor history on all fronts of the failed drug war. And as a chronic, or as a cancer patient who has also benefited from marijuana, I would point out that the 3 medications you mentioned, including the Sativex, which isn't even on the market yet, are very difficult to come by, only contain 2 2 alkaloids as opposed to the other 258, you know, that are in the plant. And I would just respectfully say that when you say you would like to see more research done, you know, why would the DEA drag its feet all these years in rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1 with no approved medical use into Schedule 3 or 4? And especially when we have Veterans Administration and some of the other organizations acknowledging PTSD treatments and et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Yeah, you obviously know, and I could end up eating way more time on the complexity of scheduling, et cetera. So I'd be happy to talk with you offline. But your point on the education piece is particularly well done, because you're not the first person that brought up the concern in the way the question is worded. The Department of Education is currently in the process of reviewing that now and trying to make that more understandable, because people who are receiving federal aid for education and during that period get arrested or convicted for a drug offense have the ability to lose their funding. If it happened in the past, if it happened before they were ever getting the federal aid, that question ends up being misread. It is not a clearly understood question, so it's being changed.
My point entirely is that children should not be excluded from the educational system.
And we agree.
Marijuana use.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
Let me take other questions. I'm going to bounce around here if I can, but since there's only one hand up there, we'll go up here.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Yeah, just...
Thank you very much for your presentation. One of the places where there still is a drug war is in Mexico. And we can beg off and say, well, that's not the national issue. But in many ways, you can't disassociate what's going on there from what's going on here. The political left in the last election was very clear that if legalization went ahead in Mexico and in the United States simultaneously, and I'm not sure what the Rand Institute said about that, if it was just in the United States, perhaps we can curb some of the violence that's taking place south of the border and even along the border and in communities here in the United States. Would you like to return to that topic? Or
I would. I think the topic with Mexico is particularly appropriate because we have a new administration that our the president's administration is working very closely with. So a couple things. One is that the crime issues along our southwest border, particularly some of our largest cities like El Paso, Tucson, and others, have lower crime rates than many cities thousands of miles away from the border. So that question of spillover violence, et cetera, hasn't ever really impacted right along the border. The other part that becomes known is that several months ago, Alejandro Huco from Grupo Reforma did a piece on the NewsHour and talked about the misreading of the cartels as having this significant revenue stream as a result of drug trafficking, when in fact the cartels are these multifaceted transnational organized crime institutions that are involved in everything from stealing from Pemex to car parts to kidnapping to extortion, et cetera. And just one revenue stream out of all of these crime problems is involved in the drug, is a part of the drug problem. So I think it's easy to kind of just look at them and say, gee, these are drug trafficking organizations, these are drug cartels, when in fact these are just really complex criminal organizations that President Calderon very courageously took on, and I believe you're seeing some similar efforts in safety and security by the new Peña Nieto administration also.
Other questions? Sure.
Thank you for being here, and I appreciate your third or middle ground approach. I think it's probably best for the country. I had two quick follow-up questions to points that you discussed earlier. One, frankly, was whether you would consider rescheduling marijuana to something other than Schedule 1, given there are a lot of questions about whether it's truly as dangerous as some of the other, more powerful narcotics that are Schedule 1. The other question was about the prescription drug problem. Yeah. You talked a lot about how severe it is. What specifically can be done from a policy perspective to really attack that problem, decrease it, And are large pharmaceutical companies helpful in that regard, or can they be obstructions?
Yeah, let me just, because I'll stay and be happy to talk with you on the scheduling, because it really does get into some complexities. But basically, our prescription drug problem received no attention. And when you have almost now, well, like I said, 16,600 people just from the opioid painkillers coming out of the medicine cabinet, we worked with a lot of people to put together what we think is a pretty good strategy on this. One is you have to educate physicians who didn't get a lot of education about pain management and addiction and tolerance and dependence around these drugs. You have to educate young people that because it comes out of a pill bottle or the medicine cabinet doesn't mean that it's not addictive and not dangerous. The second thing that you have to be able to do is that we know that doctors and pharmacists can't take these drugs back by law. But now with bipartisan legislation, we've been able to get a drug take-back program with the Drug Enforcement Administration has promulgated new rules to be able to help people clean out their medicine cabinets and dispose of these unneeded and expired medications in an environmentally conscious way. Prescription drug monitoring programs are electronic databases that allow doctors to see if a patient is doctor shopping. Wisconsin has one. Every state has one now except Missouri or Missouri, depending on where you are in that, and et cetera. And that's important. And the last part is the enforcement action that police departments and the federal government have taken about pill mills. Doctors who not only abuse their oath of office, but abuse their, violate the law by prescribing these very dangerous, very addictive, unneeded medications. That being said, let me just mention that the first page of the prescription drug strategy also said that there are people in chronic pain that very much need these drugs, and we don't need to turn the clock back where they are not going to get the drugs.
And the pharmaceutical companies, are they generally supportive, or are they sometimes obstructionist on some of these proposals?
Well, you know, some of the opioid painkillers have made a lot of money for some of these pharmaceutical companies. I think there's a recognition of the problem. I think we'll have to wait and see how much more helpful they can be.
Chief, are prescription drugs a problem for your department, or are you more focused on the cocaine, the other issues?
Well, they're all a problem for us. Our biggest problem here is marijuana. It goes between $3,000 and $5,000 a pound. It's a big moneymaker, and it drives a lot of our violence because of control of those drug marketplaces. It's a major driver of non-fatal shootings as well as other assaults. It's also, you know, it's funny. I've been hearing a lot lately about the gun control debate and the need for people to have, you know, assault rifles in their living rooms.
I've seen you have something
a little bit. And the irony is, you know, there's this mythology of I need a semi-automatic assault rifle to defend my house from invaders. Our experience in Milwaukee and in every major city I've ever served in is that if you have a home invasion, you just learned where there's a new drug house. Because the home invasions are drug dealers attacking other drug dealers trying to steal their drugs and money. So you know, theoretically, I suppose they could be better armed, but they're pretty well armed now. The challenge is, however, there's an extraordinary amount of money in marijuana, and that's really driving the drug trade. Even as heroin and cocaine continue, marijuana drives the trade right now.
So if you made it legal, would that change that paradigm?
Well, someone is always going to be not allowed to buy the drug, so there's always going to be a black market. I think one of the things we're touching on obliquely is the entire public health model, all right? We have a legal substance right now that makes people high. It's called alcohol. And its impact on family violence, unemployment, addiction, workplace accidents, car crashes, and violent crime is extraordinary. You know, my guy with the AK-47 that shot up the street corner a little while ago and shot 2 people was a .24. And he had THC in his system. Okay? So this is a drug that is not without extraordinary social costs, except we know it's pure and it's regulated and we tax it. So I guess that's good. But it has extraordinary social costs because there's an implicit social approval in something that's legal. If we legalize drugs just willy-nilly, all right, yes, we'll protect people's right to get high and it's a natural human instinct. I get it. But the thing is, we've never done the controlled experiment. We know what the social public health costs are of it being illegal. What would be the public health costs of it being freely available, regulated, additionally pure, and now we're going to toss it to the public health system? And before we blithely say, well, we'll just pay for the expansion of public health with our health care. Our health care is the most expensive thing in the national budget now. All right? Lobbyists spend 3 times as much money on health care than they do on defense. So I'm not real sanguine about us being able to pile more money into the health care system, number one. And number two, Gil and I have talked before, what do we do with public health problems? We figure out a way to criminalize them because nobody wants to spend money on anything else. So, I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm simply saying nobody's taken this step back and say, okay, widely available, freely available, presumably socially, sanctioned now because it's pure and regulated. What is the public health cost going to be then? And I would say we're not going to save any money and we're not going to reduce human harm.
Director, any?
Well, we know from alcohol, which is almost impossible for anyone to raise the legitimate taxes on alcohol because of the lobbying efforts. For every dollar collected for alcohol and taxes we pay, all of us pay about $8 in social, health care, and criminal justice costs. We arrest about 2.5 million people for alcohol. We arrest 700,000 people for marijuana. And there'll always be people. I mean, even the states that have passed the initiatives said that if you're under 21, you can't possess it. Well, guess what? We're going to end up arresting, if they enforce that law, they'll end up arresting an awful lot of people under 21, just like we end up arresting a lot of people for alcohol-related, including underage drinking. And you go to any university, and the greatest concern is the alcohol and binge drinking issue. So we haven't done a particularly good job with alcohol. We have tightly regulated, taxed, and controlled pharmaceuticals. We haven't done a very good job keeping those out of the hands of young people. I don't know why we should kind of pride ourselves that this time we'll do it right with marijuana.
Good to see you. There you go. Just keep your finger right on it.
You said that treatment behind bars reduces recidivism. Yet the Bureau of Prisons excludes from its 500-hour drug program inmates who have had guns.
Right.
Can you explain the rationale for that continued practice?
I think that, and actually I wouldn't speak on behalf of the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, who I know and admire, and who just actually added an additional 40 people to do drug treatment behind the walls. But I know that whether it's drug courts or whether it's in the federal prison, that they try to disentangle or move apart the drug addiction issue from any violent crime. I think that you're seeing, at least at the state level, particularly with drug courts, where people who've been involved in other types of crimes, including the drug problem, are being allowed into the drug courts. So I think it's a legitimate question for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the fact that whatever that person is arrested for, if they have a drug nexus, figuring out how to treat the drug problem before they get out makes a lot of sense.
Other questions? Barbara? Just hold your finger right on it. Just the bottom of the rim.
Oh, the bottom.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. We in Milwaukee know that the chief is correct, that marijuana use among young people is the serious drug issue that we face. We at Safe and Sound frequently conduct conversations with particularly teenagers and young teenagers. And almost to a person, they will say, marijuana should be legalized, it's not a problem, it should be readily available. What are the best arguments for convincing young people that they should not use marijuana and convince them that maybe legalization isn't a great idea? And then finally, does ONDCP still have a media campaign that's operating?
So let me start with we used to have a campaign that some of you, there's enough older people here that remember, this is your brain on drugs, and it was the two, I know, this is the 2 fried eggs, etc. There wasn't a lot of solid research that said that this program results in reduced drug use. We actually, Congress had zeroed out that program. It was once $190 million. But I had asked, and the President has asked several times for Congress to fund it at about $20 million. But what we did was to bring in a lot of social media folks who came in and spent several days with us and said, look, if you want to resonate with young people, you don't use scare tactics. And in fact, just think about extreme sports. Everyone that watches extreme sports are young people taking incredible risks, and that extreme sport has quite a draw to it. So you don't want to use scare tactics. You want to have a trusted messenger, which is a parent, a coach, a teacher, et cetera, a trusted messenger. And we don't make the message on social media. And our social media, by the way, has received about the same level of young people that understand it and recognize it above the influence, it's called, as Burger King and Coca-Cola. So among young people, it really does resonate very well. And it's about being in control. And young people want to make their own decisions. They want to be in control. And when you say that underage drinking, that drugs are going to take away that ability to control, it makes them stop and rethink. And you can see these on our website. And if you take a look at them on our website, don't call me up and say, I don't get it, because it's actually not for your age. So.
Let me take this gentleman's question.
Sort of to get back onto prescription drug medication, particularly the cost and lives that it does. There is sort of, I mean, you mentioned college campuses and binge drinking, but I mean, there's also a binge culture, and I think it's partially due to the over-medication of my generation in particular, whether through prescription drugs of all types. And I was wondering if you could touch on that and perhaps talk about the perception that I think my generation particularly has of it being okay to have used prescription drugs when it's clearly not.
Yeah, it's been incredibly eye-opening for me and actually unbelievably sad. So I spent 4 days in eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, several times, and these are the poorest parts of this. I mean, the poorest parts of this country. And in several of the counties, it became so commonplace to use prescription drugs and to use prescription drugs every day. And there wasn't anyone that I met with, including people that were incarcerated, people lost brothers, husbands, wives, children, etc., prescription drugs. And then I go to college campuses, and I go to New York, and I look at the amount of money people are paying for college tuition, et cetera. And I see this same level of medication, over-medication. And if you take a look, 3 Sundays ago, the New York Times devoted 2.5 pages to Adderall and a suicide of a young person in Virginia on Adderall. I mean, we kind of developed, and you know, I think we're the only direct-to-consumer marketing for drugs in the world. I mean, when you travel the rest of the world and turn on the TV, you don't see 2 people in a bathtub having all their problems fixed because somebody took a pill. So I think we really do need to rethink, and I think you're seeing a lot of the rethinking being done by medical professionals about, is this too much?
Let me take 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
I want to admit some ignorance here. Chief Flynn, do we have drug courts in Milwaukee?
Yes.
And how effective do you find them?
Well, they're very helpful because they're able to focus treatment on individuals whose primary problem is the drug addiction as opposed to the conduct. I mean, obviously, as the director was pointing out, one of the challenges for the system is, are we looking at somebody who has a drug problem who happen to have a gun, or we have somebody who has a gun problem who happen to have drugs? It's a big difference to us, because the one fellow really treatment isn't his problem. Violence is. The other fellow, treatment may change his life. So, yes, we have them, and they're a great way to focus special resources on people to, get them out of the system entirely by dealing with their underlying problem.
Does that help them? Does that help them then again when they go out and try and find a job? That's the other thing. If they've got a record, they're going to have, this is a very difficult job market to start with. But
I think our society has gotten a lot more understanding for people whose primary problem is a form of addiction. I mean, obviously, if somebody's a career armed robber, it's a little harder to place them. But, I mean, but it can happen. If enough time passes, that becomes errors of my youth. But, employers are a little chary about some types of crimes rather than others. But I think when it comes to, primarily drug-related issues, there's a level of empathy, there but for the grace of God,
Removing the stigma around drug use and having more people talk about it much more openly, whether it's Matthew Perry, who talks about it frequently. Our deputy director, Michael Botticelli, has been in recovery and will clearly tell you this for 25 plus years. And he ran the substance use program for the state of Massachusetts. And it's everything. What's so interesting to me is having traveled now the world, but particularly in the country, is to meet so many people who are back because of treatment. Boy, instead of being on the tax rolls, they're taxpayers. Instead of their kids being in foster care, they're taking care of their kids. And you see this all the time, and yet I don't think we encourage that discussion enough. We don't need to keep penalizing people.
Let me take one or two final questions. I haven't got anybody up there. The gentleman right there. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for coming out. It seems like there's really two basic core elements to the drug issue. It's the enforcement mechanism and also treatment. In regards to the enforcement part of it, it seems like there's an inevitability that most of these things are going to become legal at some point in time. So are we doing anything to prepare for that inevitability, or are we just holding on to the past? And in terms of the treatment mechanism, alcoholism, of course, is a very good analogy to the drug problem. We don't have a proper treatment mechanism for alcoholism. The recidivity rate for people who go through AA is no different than people that quit cold turkey. So you seem to have a lot of confidence that we have a treatment mechanism for drugs, but I'm not sure why you seem so confident that we have an ability to effectively treat the problem.
Well, I think that I challenge you on the inevitability of all these drugs becoming legal, because I'll just take, for example, my own state, Washington State. So it's $6 million of outside money, the kinds of things that people really decry when they say, boy, you don't want to buy an election and use all these slick ads, et cetera. So $6 million of outside money goes into these incredible ads that just make it so attractive. And in the same way in California, although it failed because a lot of mothers and a lot of independents and a lot of others did not pass it, I thought, boy, I should be voting for this. I mean, police departments can go back to chasing murderers instead of chasing kids for marijuana. We're going to reduce violence. We're going to collect all of this taxes. Oh, and by the way, these taxes are going to help our schools. I actually thought lotteries were the savior of our schools, but apparently not. So I'm not so sure that when the facts are kind of out there and people take a look at it, that just to say, okay, the legalization is just as much of an answer as the war on drugs. I think it's a lot more complex, and I'm not so sure those two states won't go through a tough time with drugged driving and all of the other things that are associated with this before people say, gee, maybe this isn't the best way.
Got time for one brief question. Go ahead. Ben, waiting patiently.
I just wanted to say I find it funny that everybody's against the, not so much against the alcohol, but they're saying how bad marijuana would be for if it was legalized. When are we going to realize that prohibition is the problem? It's not the actual drug itself. People aren't breaking into these houses because they're dope houses and drug houses. They're breaking into these houses because they know the people that they're going to break into can't call the police and say, hey, my drugs were just stolen.
Actually, they do.
We all...
That's why we know about it.
Okay. we all know.
Very common.
We all know that regulation, not legalization, but with legalization you get regulation. And with the black market drugs, cocaine, heroin, crack, even marijuana, the safest of all of them, with regulation, you get the age restrictions, the safety restrictions, like we have with alcohol, which is causing a huge social cost on Wisconsin especially, But yet we justify that legalization because the lobbying costs, the taxes that we get out of it. When are we going to realize this marijuana, the medical marijuana, isn't as bad as it is not under prohibition? 18 states have already have it medical. 2 states have fully recognized it as a recreational drug, safer than alcohol. When are we going to realize that prohibition is the issue, not the drug?
Well, I mean, I think if you read Joseph Okrent's Last Call, which is probably the seminal work on prohibition, he comes to, and that was the piece that was used for Ken Burns. He came to the conclusion, he said the one thing, and he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times saying don't confuse prohibition with alcohol, with prohibition with drugs. You know, you may have reasons to want to legalize drugs. Don't link the two. He said the one thing people forget about prohibition with alcohol is that as a country we drank less. I'm going to leave it at that.
I'm going to wrap things up there. I want to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, thanks to all of you for your attention, your interest today. That's wonderful to see. I want to thank Chief Ed Flynn from the Milwaukee Police Department for being with us. And, of course, we want to thank Director Kerlikowske. Although before I give you the chance to give him a final round of applause, I did want to ask you about the name, the Drug Czar.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
You know, I am, my wife loves being called the Tsarina, so...
Thanks very much for being with us. Thank you.
Well, very much.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Chief, thanks.